are you arguing that it would be difficult because obviously us today, we have and the best way I can illustrate this is when it comes to the common variants worldwide and also the rare. If we were to just look at humans, okay, there's roughly 10 to 15 million common variants found around the world. And you and I, Andrew, we have about 3 million places in our genomes where one chromosome, we would find one place where we got a different letter from dad than we got from mom. So basically 3 million places in the genome where we have differences. And if in terms of common alleles, we've got somewhere between 10 and 15 million worldwide, then we alone, you and I, we carry about 1/3 of the world's diversity. Okay. But obviously Adam and Eve, they would have had more than, let's say, 10 million common variants. They could have had 20 to 30 million. And then at the flood, half are lost. And so now you're left with 10 to 15. And today, we've got about 10 to 15 million, 4,500 years since the flood. So obviously, Adam and Eve's genomes are going to be different than ours today. And then also Noah and his families at the flood. As there has been diversification, there's been sorting out of these pre-existing alleles. And so a lot, as you pointed out earlier, would be in recessive form. This is the reality of the model. But why, with what you're presenting, I mean, maybe I don't understand why that is like a falsification or a challenge.
Because you're saying that today so within a single within a single set of chromosomes, so one from our Adam, for example, you're saying we have 3 million differences in that one set, right? So together we would have up to 6 million differences, right?
Well, you and I today have 3 million differences. So you and I share 1/3 of the world's diversity today in terms of common alleles. And so, yeah, Adam probably would have had about 20 million. Okay. But the rare ones is where we can start picking out, oh, these are probably mutations, right? Like blue eyes. I have blue eyes, but blue eyes, we would all agree is a mutation, but it's only found in a subset of the population. And so we can tell, okay, that was probably a mutation that was introduced to the human population sometime after Babel, when people started spreading out. But the 10 million common variants that we all basically have, we can easily say, yeah, that is design diversity. That would have been in Adam, but Adam would have had even more. Adam probably would have had somewhere between 20 to 30 million, where half of that was lost at the flood because it was a bottleneck, right? Short-lived, but a bottleneck nonetheless. And so Adam or Noah could have lost half of that, and yet we're left with 10 million.
Well, that's why I'm trying to, because you're saying there are 10 million or more differences around today. And it seems like you're assuming that they can be traced all the way back to a single individual or to these single pair of individuals. I'm saying that they can't. That defies the math of coalescence theory and how these differences within a population can be traced back so far. Like you can't have more differences today, and all those differences are also present in the original individual.
Hey, Donnie, I'm going to have to get off of here. But before I go, let me make a quick comment real quick before I go. I have to get off. But I would just say what we're talking about now is changes to allele frequency, genetic similarities between various kinds of creatures. Genetic similarities don't show that new information that relates to defines anatomical structures has ever arisen, or that there's any mechanism for it in DNA, and that's necessary for evolution to be true. By the way, continuous changes to allele frequency get certain genes turned off while others become prominent, and that's a continuous but slow loss of genetic information, and it's genetic entropy. Actually, over a period of thousands of years, continuous changes of frequencies of alleles in a population causes a continuous loss of genetic information, and that's well documented even by the evolutionist camp. So changing allele frequencies in a population doesn't introduce information, it restricts it. So that certainly doesn't support evolution. I got to go. It's been a blessing to be here. Thanks, Donnie. Appreciate it.
God bless you, Nephilim.
You guys have a good one now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. You made great points. You made glorious points, you and Donnie.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Hey, guys. I wanted to go ahead and jump in here. Donnie, if you're listening, this question is going to be for you. And then the evolutionists can probably try to respond to it. So I don't think neither the evolutionists nor the creationists provide adequate evidence towards their position, because I think Ken Hovind mentioned that there's that he would agree that all dogs come from one common ancestor. So I'm just trying to kind of figure out how this happens, because right, the evolutionists will say that dogs evolved over millions of years. The creationists would say that there was one dog that was brought onto Noah's Ark, or a pair of dogs that were brought onto Noah's Ark. But I don't see any evidence to support that one pair of dogs would produce all the generic variations that we have now. So I think what I was kind of understanding from this subject is that those, like Adam and Eve, would have had all the genetic diversity in them. You know, Chinese people, Hispanic people, Caucasian people, right? All the different diversities would be in them. And when they produce kids, if they produced 100 kids, let's say, you know, some of them would look more Asian, some of them would look more dark skinned, some of them would look more light skinned. So how would you explain like the differences in dogs? Like right now, like they showed the smallest dog ever side by side by a Great Dane or like a Mastiff. Like I can't wrap my mind around that there was like one pair of dogs that was brought onto the ark, and that those dogs produced babies and kept producing babies, and every time they popped out a baby, it was completely different because of all the genetic diversity. And then they started kind of grouping them, like, oh, these two are really small, so let's keep these two together and breed these two and keep breeding these two small ones. And these two are really big, so let's keep breeding these two really big ones. So how do we kind of explain that, Donnie?
It's a great question. Starting with your Adam and Eve point. Yeah, if Adam and Eve were, let's say, skin color, if they were genetically heterozygous, so they were in a state of DNA diversity in terms of skin color, capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, they would be a middle skin, a middle brown. And so from there, they have the genetic potential to explain all of the ethno differences that we see today, especially after the Tower of Babel. Once people groups start spreading out and they become isolated, well, what they do is they take certain traits with them, and they also accumulate their own unique mutations that other groups around the world that are in their own isolated geographical regions, they start accumulating their own differences. And depending on the environment too, like Neanderthal, they're built for an eco-glacial environment. That's where we find them across Eurasia. And because of those environmental conditions, that seems to, in many ways, dictate their morphology. But when it comes to the animals, dogs, cats, so on and so forth, firstly, we've done a study where we look at the number of species there are anyways per animal. And there's really not that many. You know, my question, and if you want, Andrew, note it down and feel free to answer it at some point. Why do we have such few species in general? Like, let's say birds, okay? This says 10,000. The most up-to-date, I think it's about 17,000, but it's almost nothing. So if you take birds, the evolutionary story, birds, let's say they evolved somewhere between 100 and 300 million years ago, okay? From theropod-like dinosaurs. Well, today we're already seeing examples of new bird species formed in real time. Okay, there's on the Galapagos Island, we've seen, look at a new bird species has evolved. And this was in 2017. There was a new paper in 2023 that came out discussing this information as well. And so we're seeing new bird species form in real time. But you're telling me that birds evolved over 100 million years ago, and yet all we have is 10 to 17,000 species. That fits more in line with the biblical model, where you have birds coming off of the ark and speciating, because when we actually look at the genotype and we see what is resulting in these changes, yes, we see the morphological changes, but what is dictating these changes? What's happening on a genetic level? It is a reduction in allelic variability. It shifts in more heterozygosity to less heterozygosity. And so the pre-existing variability, it's being sorted out over time to create new variations. That means these species are hitting walls. Look at lizard species, less than 5,000. Bats, there's only 1,200. Rabbits, 29 species. You know, you can go through all these. Felids, there's only about 37 species. And so, yes, to what you were saying, Josh, you have, let's go bears. You have a bear archetype that comes off of the ark, okay, that has pre-existing DNA differences. And from those pre-existing DNA differences, you get your 8 different bear species, you know, 7 or 8 different bear species. And all it takes for speciation are breakaway populations. So you have a larger population, a smaller population breaks away from that. They become isolated. They start inbreeding. Genetically, you get shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. Once you get enough genetic distinctiveness from the parent population, you get a new species. But all of this is due to a reduction in allelic variability from a more heterozygous ancestor that came off of the ark. So we're not adding anything novel. There's no real meaningful anatomical change. There's no increase in phenotypic complexity. It's just the sorting out of pre-existing allelic variability. That's why if you look at a Chihuahua and compare it genetically to a wolf, the Chihuahuas hit a wall. You're never going to get 2 Chihuahuas and create a wolf. But you could take 2 wolves, and over time, the allelic variability that's present in wolves, you could get a Chihuahua. You could get all of your domestic dogs. But you're not going to take some of these domestic dogs that have lost a lot of allelic variability and potential for change and get a wolf, because you'd have to be going backwards. And that's simply not possible. So does that answer your question somewhat, Josh?
It definitely does.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't ask me, but I'm just, I don't know.
Yeah, I think kind of like what I'm saying, like, and I think maybe what you just said about having lost their genital diversity possibility. Like if I took my German Shepherds and I kept breeding my German Shepherds and I bred them non-stop until the day that they died, they would never produce anything other than a German Shepherd. They would there's a pit bull is not magically going to come out of that. Now, I've done the DNA test like on my dogs, and it shows the
evolution already predicts that, though.
Well, I done the DNA on my dogs, and it shows the different types of DNA that both my dogs have. So, are you saying that if I keep breeding them long enough, they would eventually produce something similar to one of the DNA differences that is in there? Like there would have been like a model bear, a model cat, a model dog, which would be the wolf that has all these. But there's still a wolf now that if you keep breeding wolves with wolves, like how likely are we to get a small enough dog to the point where we whittle it down all the way to a Chihuahua? And I still don't see that. We see evidence.
Well, mainly in the wild, probably not. That's why in the wild, what do you see? Well, let's take felids, or let's take felids from a more heterozygous archetype. Those pre-existing DNA differences and the subsequent migration, breakaway populations, inbreeding, isolation, shifts in heterozygosity or homozygosity, that potential's there in the archetype. And from there, you can get lions, cougars, cheetahs, tigers, so on and so forth. It's a trivial amount of species in 4,500 years. In light of the fact that today we're seeing new species formed, especially with birds. Okay. But are you going to be able to take, let's say, 2 cheetahs and get that original archetype? No, because there's been a loss of allelic variability. There's been a sorting out process, okay? But with what you're saying, the domestic dogs, Josh, and it's a good point, it's a fair point, but that is due to artificial selection, where we're manipulating the genomes. We're taking certain traits, we're emphasizing them. You know, we're taking the trait for smallness, we're taking the trait for, you know, thicker fur, thinner fur, so on. And that's why there's a lot of problems with these domestic dogs. Like take a bulldog, you know, the way that a lot of that is very problematic to them. A lot of this is due to mutations, abnormalities. So yeah, in the wild, you're going to get what we see with bears. From a bear archetype, you get, most of the bears are not differentiating as much as like the domestic dogs, right? Which is due to artificial selection.
Oh, can I get in on this?
Grayson, what's going on?
In here.
I was gonna add. So
because...
Donny, your answer to Josh is basically on the ark. Noah took the animal that had the perfect amount of variability to give to result in the many different dogs we see now, right?
Right.
So can I get in on this? Okay, because Donny mentioned dogs and bears, and I was highly triggered because I want to know from the creationist perspective, right? Since you say that there was a dog kind on the ark and there was a bear kind on the ark, but evolution would predict something a little bit.
Hey, Grayson, hold that thought. Hold that thought. I have to find out who's making dinner live on air. Let me see. Arminius, please mute yourself if you're in the middle of doing dishes. Let's get in the habit, people. If you're not talking and you have a lot of background noise.
Sorry, it's the kids in the background. I'll mute myself.
No worries, brother. No worries. It's completely fine.
So my point was just
that
from like a phylogenetic perspective, right? Dogs and bears are pretty closely similar genetically. So evolution would predict that we should find fossils of bear dogs and dog bears. That would be a prediction. That there would be no reason to predict such, mosaic creatures in a creation model. But then when we actually look, we find fossils that are dog-like bears and bear-like dogs. So how would you explain, and this is not just related to dogs and bears, but this happens all over the place. Whenever you find two groups that are genetically similar, evolution would predict you to find transitional fossils, and then we find them in that pattern. How can creationists explain that pattern?
Another way to say it is the farther back in time you go for any two group, the more similar their common ancestors are going to look.
Good questions, fair points. Grayson, good to have you, my man. Looking forward to your debate with Neff. And
I'm just listening from this point, Donny. I think I'll just kind of soak it in because I'm grabbing some groceries. But go ahead and just kind of. I think I got some of my answer, but I'll just keep listening.
Yeah, stick around. It's an open mic. You know, everybody's
got you
getting involved.
I think what Grayson said supports creationism, though.
How?
Well, let me answer real quick, and then we'll all go back and forth. So yes, as you can see here, you've got a bear archetype, right, that comes off of the ark. I should give a shout out to Matt. He did for our conference at Ark Animals on the Ark. So he did a lot of investigation into this, and he gave a detailed presentation. So anyways, yes, dogs. So a canid archetype, bear archetype, felid, so on and so forth. You get the different species. Now, phylogenetically, many of these creatures that us as creationists would say are separate when it comes to ancestry, like bears and dogs. They do have a lot of similarities in their genetics. And as you pointed out, Grayson, we find in the fossil record interesting creatures that have been called bear dogs or dog bears. And so that's interesting because you have a creature that basically blends the features of canids and then also bears that we find today. As a creationist, I am not opposed to finding interesting mosaics, creatures that do blend the features of other creatures, like your bear dogs, in the same way that we find man-made things, let's say modes of transportation, where we have the same thing. So for example, here we have a tank, but then we've also got a military vehicle that would be built for the sea. Okay. This is a blending of those, of a ship and also a tank. And so this is a military amphibious assault vehicle. And so this vehicle would do lousy if it was just for, like, let's say a tank obviously wouldn't do well in the water. A ship wouldn't do well on land. But this vehicle does well for that transitional environment from sea to land. Okay, so yes, it does blend the features of two different vehicles, tanks and ships, but it's designed that way. And so I think in the fossil record, we do find a lot of interesting creatures like your synapsids, therapsids, bear dogs. Okay, but I don't think that necessitates a bear dog is a pre-existing form to bears and dogs. I think it's just an interesting.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I would also like a response.
So I was just going to say, in the case of tanks and amphibious assault vehicles, what you're showing there is a blend, so to speak, between two very different things, a land vehicle and a boat or a ship. In the case of evolution, the prediction is the opposite of that. You're finding mosaics between two groups that, based on different independent lines of evidence, you already think are very closely related. So going back, they look very similar to one another. You're not finding, say, a blend between a bear and a mouse, for example. You don't find blends of those kinds of features. Whereas in the amphibious assault vehicle, you do see those kinds of very drastic, kind of cliche crocoduck kind of blending going on there. That's not what evolution predicts. So it's a very subtle but important difference between what you're showing and what Grayson was talking about, which is these amphicyonids, these bear dogs, between these two very closely
wait a minute.
related.
No, wait. I said I was going to have a response too. Let me respond, and then Bubble, you can get in. But
all right,
I just wanted to make the point. Okay, Andrew, you kind of stole my thunder because I basically had the same point, but I was going to phrase it as essentially saying that when an actual intelligence is what's responsible for making these hybrids, you can hybridize between any two groups you want. They don't have to be closely related, like Andrew was saying. But the thing is that we're not just finding these random hybrids between these random groups. The hybrid, like the mosaic creatures that we're finding, are the ones that are predicted by evolution between two closely related species. So it's the pattern that counts, not just the fact that we find hybrids. Sure, we can find mosaic creatures in a creation model, but it's the pattern of those finds that is what is predicted by evolution and simply accommodated by creationism.
So I think let me get this straight there. Wait.
Bubblegum, I want to respond.
All right, so then it's my turn.
Yes, I've been going at it with Grayson and Andrew, and so I need to address the points that were brought up. Firstly, when it comes to the design hypothesis and what humans can design, obviously we're going to be limited as compared to what God has designed in the biological world. Our starting point is, okay, the Bible says that we are made in the image of God. So from that starting point, there must be something about us that reflects the divine. Okay, so maybe we can get a sense for how God designed the biological world based on the way we design things. But we're just catching up with the way that God, an infinite being, has designed. He's also designed his creatures, his creations, with the ability to reproduce, to pass on genes, to pass on genetics. Imagine we could do that on the assembly line. You know, Chrysler's builds a few different types of vehicles, an SUV, a crossover, and a cool car. And then from there, they're able to just reproduce or replicate. Okay, I mean, you'd save a lot of money and time, and that would be pretty cool. And so we're not at that point. We're not that sophisticated, okay? And so it's not going to be an apples to apples comparison. We're getting an idea. We're getting a sense. And I would argue that we could find somewhat of a similar pattern. I mean, right here, you've got a unicycle, a bicycle, and a four-wheeler. Okay, well, we would predict there must be, you know, a three-wheeler out there. And yeah, of course, we've designed something like that. And sure, you could say pattern, put that right in between the bicycle and the four-wheeler. And one could say, oh, you know, the bicycle or the three-wheeler must be, the tricycle is an intermediate between the four-wheeler and the bicycle. And the same thing with the amphibious assault vehicle.
So Stanley, real quick, go back to that graphic there. So I just want to demonstrate a flaw in that analogy there. So that unicycle there, show me a specific trait that all of the subsequent members share that is unique to the unicycle, but also uniquely defines the rest of the members there, such that they form a single group, a single clade, if you will. So give me an example of that kind of feature.
I could ask you the same thing with a bear dog. I mean, a bear dog has traits in common with a bear and a canid today. Take a wolf and a black bear. What in the bear dog is unique to the bear dog that we don't find in a canid today?
No, I'm not saying that in the bear dog that wasn't unique in canids and bears. I'm saying the opposite, that is shared by the common ancestor of, say, canids and ursids, bears in this case, shared by their common ancestor that is also found that defines the clade caniformia in this case. That includes canids and bears. Find that same kind of feature for the unicycle or the car or whatnot in any of these supposed analogical analogous phylogenies.
It's a good question. It's a fair question. It's in the same way that we can take a group of organisms and call them mammal-like reptiles, because they seem to have these traits that are that we find in reptiles and mammals. Not quite a reptile, not quite a mammal, seems to be in between, these interesting therapsids and synapsids. Okay, so we have that group. Well, we can do the same thing with crossovers. If you go to a car lot, pick your car lot, you're going to have a section on that car lot. Let's say that car lot has 500 vehicles. You're going to have a section that is crossover SUVs. And so a customer can come, go right to the crossover SUV section and say, okay, because the crossover SUVs do have characteristics and traits that make them a what? A crossover SUV, which, by the way, essentially resists classification. Is it a van? Is it an SUV? No, it's something in between, and it's built that way for a purpose. It's designed that way because it's good design. It gets people from A to B. It is designed in a way that helps people. Okay, and so it's its own group. It's its own category, in the same that some of these so-called transitional forms are their own groups because of very specific traits and characteristics that.
Well, they are their own groups, but they're also they follow the same nested hierarchy that you would see for modern taxa.
Wait,
so
Donny, I just want to know.
That is the difference.
Question. Donny, do you think, or do you accept that we can predict what kind of mosaic fossils we should find beforehand using like evolution and phylogenetics?
I think you can make some predictions, but then other predictions would not come true in the way that you'd like it to. I mean, you're going to disagree with this. Feel free to respond. Like Tiktaalik, for example, the famous fishapod. You guys predicted it in a certain area in a certain time, but years after it was discovered, they found tetrapod foot tracks somewhere between 20 and 40 million years, according to evolutionist time, prior to Tiktaalik, saying that true tetrapods existed before Tiktaalik, which I would argue fits the Creationist model because we have these interesting mosaics overlapping with other creatures, like your Tiktaalik, which is a fishapod, you could say, exists in an overlapping way with what? Fish and amphibians. Okay.
All right.
So
is it my turn now?
Theory that says intermediate species have to go extinct once a different species evolves.
Right. I understand. I understand you can accommodate for it, right? I'm not saying it falsifies the evolutionary hypothesis in terms of transitional forms. I'm just saying it's more so agnostic. We see true tetrapods before Tiktaalik, and we would argue, yeah, Tiktaalik is an interesting mosaic, but it exists in an overlapping way with what?
But you
the same
do agree
creatures that you would argue are representing it as a transitional, fish and amphibians.
But you do
Not
agree that at least its characteristics, its anatomy and morphology was predicted. Whether or not like Tiktaalik is the transitional ancestor or just a sister clade, I mean, it has the actual anatomical features that were predicted for such a transition to have the mosaic qualities. Like it has a neck and wrist bones. I mean, come on, those were predicted.
So you're arguing. I'll respond, Grayson. You take a quick response. Bubblegum, you jump in because I know you've been dying to get in on this. So you're arguing because, Grayson, we have fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, right? Then the evolutionary model would predict, okay, we should find then a creature in the fossil record that blends the characteristics of what? Reptiles, mammals, because it goes fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. Or we should find a creature in the fossil record that blends the features of fish and amphibians, because essentially amphibians came from fish.
Mm-hmm.
Is that representing?
It's not that ladder-like. It's more nested than that. It's not a ladder-like progression.
You're arguing the pattern should reflect that we have these forms in between the major classifications we find today: fish, amphibians, reptiles.
If I could just rephrase what you're saying, but I basically agree. It's just like when we look at all tetrapods today, like all tetrapods today are most closely genetically similar to lobe-finned fishes, like the lungfish. So we would predict that they should have a common ancestor at some point in the past that would have mosaic qualities of both today, like tetrapods, and those lobe-finned fishes. And so that's what we find in Tiktaalik. It doesn't matter that whether or not it's the transitional or just a sister clade of the transitional. What matters is that it has those actual anatomical characteristics that are mosaic, that were predicted.
Right. I understand what you're saying. It's more or less what I said. Yeah, it's more or less what I said. And I appreciate that. And so in the same way that we would argue God designed the biological world, he designed these distinct groups, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, it would be on the creationist side, we would be guilty of a uniformitarian assumption if we assumed it's always been that way. No, in the past, in the fossil record, we do find other groups like mammal-like reptiles, like bear dogs, okay, that seem to blend these features. And so the further we go back in the past, we would say the pre-flood world, we do have these interesting groups that might not necessarily fit in these categories that we see today: fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. And so since God isn't going back to the drawing board every time he designs a creature, the original archetype of these creatures, he can borrow designs, he can reuse designs in the same way that we as human designers do the same thing. Notice this hierarchy right here. Sedans and SUVs share more in common with each other than a sedan does with, let's say, another engine powered vehicle like a plane. But as human engineers, yeah, we can take various traits or characteristics of, let's say, SUVs and vans, which are their own categories, and create something like a crossover SUV. But again, we're not as sophisticated, we're not as intelligent, we're not as powerful as an infinite God who did something similar, but he gave animals the ability to reproduce, to pass on their genetic variation, to adapt. And so it's not going to be an apples to apples, but I think it gives us a sense of how God could have created. And so those mosaics, I would say, are expected on the creationist side, but they're also expected on your side. It is a prediction. And so it is one of those points that, hey, okay, it looks good for the evolution side, but the creationists can explain it too. But I think it also misses the point of extreme stasis. I think it misses convergent evolution. I think we could get into each one of those points that I would say is an inconsistency. But okay, I said enough there. Grayson, have a response, and then Bubbles, let's see what you have to say.
Like to respond.
Go ahead. So start with Grayson.
Okay, I'm okay with ceding the response to Andrew. I just want to make a point, Donnie. Please stop using this slide. I'll talk to you about it later, but you know I have issues with this slide just because this slide doesn't make any sense on its face of it. Like, you have unpowered vehicles as the large umbrella category, and within that you have powered vehicles.
Now with Grayson.
You have powered vehicles nesting within unpowered vehicles. That just doesn't make any sense. But like, no, if we want to use that slide, right? Like, right, you can make the predictions.
I understand your concern. I understand your concern.
Yeah, but all you have to do is just delete the word unpowered, and then it would at least be accurate, as long as they all just nest within vehicles, just in general. But anyways, the point is
that the whole group. But let me just say this: the whole group would be vehicles.
Yes, exactly.
But in here, unpowered vehicles is in like bikes, okay, skateboards,
but
things
not
like
all
that.
the
That would be.
groups
Let me just
included in
finish
that
my
group
thoughts,
are
Andrew,
unpowered.
please. We're going on 3 hours. Would be akin to here, right? Humans and primates have a lot more in common than humans and other kinds of mammals. Let's say, you know, whales. But then you get to insects, invertebrates. And so you can see this unpowered vehicles as being invertebrates, where we still have, with sedans, which is a powered vehicle, much in common with an unpowered vehicle like a bicycle, in the same way that, sure, humans and chimps share more in common with each other than, let's say, humans, chimps, and whales. But we still have some in common with invertebrates like insects, even though we have less in common, a lot less in common with an insect than we would with, let's say, a chimpanzee or something in the great ape family. I do understand your concern, but that's the point I'm trying to make is, hey, these unpowered vehicles, you can compare them to invertebrates like insects, which are so distant from us in terms of similarity, but there still is some similarity there, in the same way that a sedan even has some things in common with a bike. I understand your concern, but do you kind of see where I'm coming from there?
It's just that vertebrates don't nest within invertebrates. That doesn't make any sense. Like, they're two different groups that each nest within a larger umbrella group. So what you're showing here is a nested hierarchy, which you can't have vertebrates nesting within invertebrates. You can't have powered vehicles nesting within unpowered vehicles. It just doesn't make sense on its face. But again, it's a small thing. It's a small nitpick. I just wish you would just update this slide. It's very easy to just delete unpowered and it would all be right.
But in order to not stress you out, what would you title the bicycle?
Just vehicles.
Just vehicles. Okay.
Right.
But then over here with insects being invertebrates, would you retitle this?
Like animals or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a larger umbrella category for which the other categories nest within. But anyways, I want to make the point that, like, in nature, we see like hybrids between two adjacent groups. We don't see like mosaic qualities like that skip over groups like you do when there's intelligent design involved. Like with intelligent design, you could have like a sedan hybrid with a plane or something, but you don't see that in the natural world.
Or you can have free-wheeled vehicles, for example, that kind of stuff.
But I do think,
all right. Let's just wrap it up there.
In terms of some categories like SUV and a van, an SUV and a van are going to have much more in common than an SUV would with a plane or a van would with a plane. But right in between an SUV and a van is where you can have a crossover. And so the vans and the SUVs are both very similar. And yet you've got a separate category that has features or characteristics from both. And that's a crossover SUV. Okay. Well, yes. Some things we can get a little wild and take a skateboard and, take parts of a car and glue it on and do this and get a little crazy. Yeah. God didn't do that. Okay. He's a little more sophisticated than us. He thinks ahead. He also created his creations to, again, reproduce, to pass on genes, to adapt. We haven't yet gotten to the point technologically to do that with our designs. But hey, maybe 1,000 years later we will. Go ahead.
Well, so then why do you use this analogy for
I think that Bubblegum's head is
my turn.
It's Bubba's turn.
So, Bubblegum, don't let me regret letting you go in here.
Well, first off, I want to start off by asking you guys a question. You guys are familiar with a kids cartoon called Pokemon, right?
Yeah.
All right then. So I got look. Right.
I'm sorry,
all right. So would you,
Robert?
Okay. Would you, Robert, say that Pokemon is a creationist worldview or an evolutionist worldview?
This is stupid already.
Just answer the question.
It's the evolutionist because it sucks at creating rules. So.
Okay. What about you, Grayson? Do you think it's Pokemon is a creationist worldview or an evolutionist worldview?
It's neither. It's a fictional world.
Dude, just go by the cartoon. You know what? I know it's
it's a dumb question. I'm not gonna give it an answer because
all right then, Andrew, you play along. Andrew, you play along.
The closest noun to describe it would be metamorphosis, but I would agree with Grayson. It would be neither evolution nor creationism.
So neither. Okay, what about you, Donny?
There's not even a religion in Pokemon.
There is.
Why would you even bring that up?
Just let him continue, guys. Be quiet.
Right. What about you, Donnie? Do you think Pokemon is an evolutionist worldview or a creationist worldview?
Wait, Bubblegum, is Monsters Inc. a creationist or an evolutionist movie?
Bubblegum, just continue playing. Don't entertain that.
Monsters
what about
Inc.
Digimon?
Okay. Does Monsters Inc. talk about creationism or evolution? No,
Neither does Pokemon.
Pokemon does. If you actually watch the cartoon, it does.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah, have you actually watched the cartoon?
Yeah.
I watched it. Clearly haven't watched all the episodes because if you actually watched it, they do talk about creation. So in Pokemon evolution, they have a god. And in this Pokemon world, the god creates these kinds which have a preloaded evolutionary. So you'll never see a Pikachu evolve into a Charizard. So can we really consider a Christian creationism, young earth creationism, creationist? I don't think so.
Oh my god!
I would say I would call them. I would call them more. As Andrew said, I would consider them metamorphosis. They're not really creationists.
So Bubblegum, if I just grant you that Pokemon is creationist, does that change the fact that in the real world, evolution
they're not creationists? Look, they have a god who creates the original kinds of Pokemon, but the Pokemons are preloaded with these evolutions. So a Pikachu will never evolve into a Charizard. But this is no different than what the Christians are saying. So how can we consider the Christians to be creationists? I would consider them more along the lines of metamorphosis, like Andrew said.
Okay.
Wait, Bubblegum, you're an evolutionist?
Pokemon,
no, I'm a creationist.
Creationist. All right, very good. You've contributed.
I didn't. Andrew, Grayson, when did I say that?
You just said it, dude.
Were you paying attention? I don't think you were paying attention.
We all know Pokemon is real.
So Bubblegum, are you a theist or not?
I'm a theist.
No, you don't want to ask him that, dude. He's a polytheist.
He just said he was a creationist.
Well, because every time I've seen him in a debate, it's like it's not theism. It's something he made up.
He's a polytheist.
Okay.
Can I try and steal Bubblegum's position?
Go ahead, Andrew.
He thinks that every race has their own god.
This is why I can't take him seriously, though. Like,
why?
Donnie takes you seriously. That's all that matters.
You just say things that they're not. It seems like you're just making up.
I don't think you were paying attention.
Bro, you're trying to use Pokemon to disprove evolution.
You use Pokemon. Like
that's not
it's already been
Bubblegum.
Already trying to disprove it.
I was trying
to land the plane. Bubblegum, can you land the plane? What's the point you're trying to make with Digimon?
I'm gonna let Andrew steelman me. Go ahead, Andrew. Steel me because these people clearly didn't pay attention.
If I understand his explanation correctly, I think what Bubblegum is saying is that the modern younger creationist view with kinds and speciation after the flood, etc., is more evolutionist, so to speak, than kind of like how he was describing Pokemon. Am I correct there, Bubble?
Yes.
So well, it's a silly argument because Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard, there's some major anatomical differences. Charmander doesn't have wings. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's designed heterozygosity.
But this is no different than your belief of like preloaded bear.
The created heterozygosity model would not say that a creature like a felid or a canid has the pre-existing genetic variability to manifest wings at some point. That's a major anatomical change. We were arguing earlier that there's a lot of morphological adaptability built into organisms, but not anatomical adaptability. Okay, you're not going to get a creature like Charmander evolving wings over time.
Let's not forget the magic.
Actually reminds me of something else I wanted to bring up.
There's no magic.
Bubblegum, I just wanted to add, Pokemon doesn't suck. I just don't prefer it because it's like animal abuse. They're like, why don't they just fight? They're just using animals to fight. But keep going though. Sorry.
Well, I think Pokemon, because they're settling their wars through Pokemon fights, so it's probably better that way. Imagine we settle all wars through a cockfight. Not a gay fight, but one of those.
You're talking about Pokemon the rest of the night.
Okay, since you said that, do you remember the kid who got killed over Pokemon cards?
Hey, come on,
we took Pokemon pretty seriously back in the day.
Yes, we did. Kids did get hurt. Anyways.
Well, I guess evolution is disproved. Pokemon is real.
Well, now I'll address your argument. So
I'm sure there's somebody named Ash Ketchum out there.
So Grayson was making the argument that since the bear and the dog share a common ancestor, you would see like a sister clade that has mosaic attributes of both. But like, what if we lacked those mosaics in other animals that had common ancestor? For example, the bear and the ape. We don't see a mosaic of a hybrid of a bear.
Because you wouldn't predict that. That's the point we were trying to make earlier.
What?
Yeah, bears and apes are not that closely related.
They're not closely. They are. By your model, they are.
No, they are related. They're not more related. By bears and dogs.
Well, because Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys are saying you have canids, you have bears, and they can go back fairly recently to a common ancestor, which you would say is a bear dog that connects the two. But
there's a chimpanzee.
Where's the bear ape?
But a chimpanzee and a bear, they're too far, according to the evolutionary story. They're too far distant.
The common ancestor between like a bear and an ape would probably look something more like a shrew, for example, because the ancestral morphotype.
It would go back further on the
because it's not just bears and apes at that point. You also have to group, like if you're talking about their common ancestor, you'd have to group all the other things that share that common ancestor that are not just apes and bears.
In terms of transitional forms, you're looking at two creatures, okay, like let's say dogs and bears that go back to a fairly recent common ancestor. Mm-hmm. Rather than taking dogs and fish, which would go back to
it's like the example. It's like the example with Tiktaalik, right? I didn't say dogs and lungfish. I said all tetrapods are the most closely related to lungfish. So, like, you would have to be looking at what characteristics are shared by all the current tetrapods, and then you would be looking for mosaics of those features with lungfish, and that's what Tiktaalik shows.
We're not predicting
you wouldn't just say, oh, what's the dog lungfish mosaic?
We're not predicting like a lungfish with bear paws, for example. That's ridiculous.
I want to bring something up because I mentioned something earlier when we were discussing this. And I think you guys just forgot to respond because I know you guys definitely have some kind of response. The number of species. Okay. We as creationists, we would argue that the number of species fit nicely within a creationist model. Okay, to take birds, for example, we got somewhere between 10 and 17,000 bird species today. We're seeing, and there was a paper recently in 2023, we were discussing it last time, Andrew, where on the Galapagos Island, they've documented new bird species in real time. Okay, so we're seeing speciation occurring quite quickly. So if we were to extrapolate that back, okay, 10,000 to 17,000 bird species in 4,500 years, that fits nicely.
I can answer this.
First, I should ask so I don't misrepresent. How long ago do you put the origin of birds from theropod dinosaurs?
I think that it's like late, like in the Jurassic period. I think
sometime in the Jurassic. It really depends what you're calling a bird at that point, because there's so many transitional features at that point.
But I just want to make the point real quick that you can essentially predict like extinction risk, because obviously a lot of these, like the vast majority of all species that have lived have gone extinct, and you can predict like extinction drift. You can predict extinction risk as a function of the species age, just using like simple like ecological drift models. So like
cool.
Like ecological drift like pretty much explains like the age of certain of most species just as a general trend.
But so if you're taking the origin of birds, let's say Archaeopteryx, you guys would say that's a transitional form. We got traits from theropod dinosaurs and also extant or modern birds. So you would, let's say 65 million to 100 million years ago, the origin of birds from theropod dinosaurs. Well, even with extinction rates, extinction events, today we're only left with 10,000 to 17,000 species of birds. From the flood 4,500 years ago, that makes sense because we understand today that speciation and adaptation can be rapid. If we start with design diversity and those DNA differences are built in from the start, then speciation is really rapid because the ones documenting these new bird species, they obviously are evolutionary scientists, so they don't believe in design diversity, but even they're admitting that speciation is happening rather quickly. We're observing it in real time. So take that back 4,500 years ago. Boom, it's easy to account for. I just want to finish my thought. So it's easy to account for that many species. Okay, but for the evolutionist model, why is there only 10 to 17,000 birds? But you take it back 65 million to 100 million years ago, there should be hundreds of thousands of bird species. And I get there are extinction events, but how many extinction events do you have to invoke to explain why there are so few bird species today? And do you have numbers for that?
Ecological
most
drift
species
can
are
account for
extinct.
a lot of this.
Well, first of all, species is just an arbitrary category we made up. We'll categorize things into like this is this species because it's one sole category. So we can invent new species by simply stricken up the category. What fits that X in X category.
Well,
so they're literally just made up.
I will also note that's very much a continuum as well. So like when you're talking about that 2023 study with that new species of finch, for example, if you looked at the ancestral finch species and the new one, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. They're at the very cusp, basically, of the speciation process, because it's not a matter of, okay, you're one species and then another moment you're a different species. It's a continuum of change, and that continuum takes a very long time typically.
Well, this is just arbitrary saying, am I identical, like an exact copy of my mother? Of course not. Of course, it's going to be the mixture of those.
Just to answer Donnie's question, like ecological drift goes a long way to explaining how you have like both periods of like lower diversity of species and increasing differences among like otherwise equivalent communities. So like ecological drift is a mechanism by which this happens. And like I said, that it trends very well into predicting like species age and extinction rates.
So when you say ecological drift, and if I missed your definition of it, I apologize. Are you arguing that some species, they can fill a niche to the point where it no longer needs to be filled, and so it remains static and remains that way for a long time, and so there's no need for growth? But then other periods of time, there is significant growth. Is that what you mean by ecological drift?
It's kind of like genetic drift in that it's like essentially a stochastic process. It's just like the changes in like a population size due to like births and deaths over time. Like it's like a stochastic process.
So if there's an extinction event, will it fluctuate upwards for an extended period of time as it rebuilds its numbers and then becomes a little more static, stays at a constant number for more or less for a while?
Here, I sent a link in the private chat of just like a study about it, but I also just recently like saw like basically like an ecological drift model that was able to like it's similar to neutral theory, but it's essentially able to model and predict like extinction risk over time for species.
Because I'd like to see, because I would like to see a sophisticated analysis with numbers on whatever species. Name your species. Let's take bird species. I think Nathaniel Jensen has done a very good job accounting for at least the bird species and putting numbers and predictions and so on and so forth. But we could do the same thing with snakes, lizards. There's not a whole lot of lizard species, 4,600. And I think with what Andrew said, because he makes an interesting point that yes, the difference between the new species and the parent species is pretty minor. And so the larger question is, should we even be calling it a different species? Because the number of species per animal that we look at could be inflated. Because depending on if you're a splitter or a lumper, we could prematurely be labeling something a new species just by a very small difference. Where somebody might think, no, that's not really enough to...
It's arbitrary because we can like say, let's see, we get a population of people with Down syndrome in the school. They would be considered a new species technically because the category is Down syndrome. let's say people with, I don't know, webbed toes because a mutation that's made them, slightly inferior. Well, now the category is webbed toes, and we just invented a new species. It's arbitrary because you can add up all these. You can keep adding categories and categories and keep inventing species.
Well, this is something I think that was being talked about in the debate with Kent, is this so-called species problem and how there are many different species concepts, because it is true that organisms can't be filed into these neat tidy categories or boxes that we would like to call species. It's very much more variable than that, and that's why you need to use different information in different areas. With like fossils, for example, you obviously don't have any DNA data left, so you have to use a morphological species concept. So it's valuable for different questions you're asking. But since organisms can't be filed into these neat categories, that's more of a result of evolution, not like created kinds kind of thing.
Well, look, since this line of thinking going down species, this wouldn't be evidence for evolution or against it because it's so arbitrary.
Well, yeah, it's not like a specific, it's not like a numerical prediction, but it's consistent with the idea of evolution, because you wouldn't if lineages are continuously splitting off from each other and diversifying in very different ways, you wouldn't expect
but that's also expected in the creationist
kind, for example.
Like, for example, web feet is also expected in the creationist model. So like this is data that doesn't like distinct which one is true. So you need some actual data that actually creates a distinction. So like we both expect there to be web feet.
Well, in that case, I would just ask what would distinguish them then. What unique prediction does creationism make that hasn't been tested yet?
For example,
hey, Donny, I have a question. Would you be okay saying that instead of one ancestral pair of dogs that produce all the dogs that we have now, whatever 300 species it may be, would you be okay with saying that maybe there was a handful of dogs on Noah's Ark rather than just one dog? Like there was like some big dogs, medium dogs, small dogs, 3 pairs of like kind of diverse dogs that would have been interbred once the Ark landed, as opposed to just saying that there was one set of dogs that produce Chihuahuas as well as Great Danes. Would you be okay with saying that, or would you still argue that it should all comes from one pair of dogs?
Josh, you already answered that.
Are dogs biblically considered clean or unclean animals?
I don't think that was his question.
I have a thought about those dogs. Well,
because I just want to answer real quick, because depending on if it's clean versus unclean, the Bible says take 7 pairs of some or 2 of others, right? Because so I think it would come down to, because I don't think there's an issue having 2 wolf-like ancestors as the archetype with an incredible amount of allelic variability and potential for change to explain all the different species we see today, which are not a whole lot. And then also with artificial selection, getting all the domestic dogs, about 400 plus domestic dogs that we see today.
Dogs are unclean, Donny, but even them being unclean, like what we would consider how we have grouped dogs nowadays, they may have been seen as different types of animals. Like this one is really big dog, this one is really small dog. So
right, there could have been like the dog kind, there could have been the wolf kind, the fox kind.
Yeah.
With felids, I believe that tigers and lions are related. They go back to an archetype that was a felid, but there are some creationists I know that believe there was a tiger kind and a lion kind. So, there's definitely questions there for us to engage, ponder, and study.
The big issue, I just want to say, the big issue is that Noah's Ark can only be so big. So you can only fit so many different kinds on it. Like you can't just have every species is its own kind and still everything fit on Noah's Ark.
That's why I would rather have just a pair of canids as an archetype, and from there you get all the different species, and then you get a group of humans. I think the evolutionists would agree, groups of humans, however many years ago, in evolutionary time, not that long ago, took some wolves, domesticated them. They're even domesticating, from my understanding, foxes today.
Yeah.
And very interestingly, the foxes are becoming a lot more like some of the dog pets that we have.
No,
there's actually been some evidence that they may have domesticated the mammoth too.
Oh, Donnie, you already asked you, just to clarify. Like, so what happened was Noah, like, just like you said, Noah, he got some canines that had the perfect amount of genetic, what's the word I'm looking for?
Variability.
Yeah, genetic variability to result in the kinds we see today. That's precisely how it was. I don't know. Josh must have not heard you, because he kept.
Well, and remember, there's a lot of studies though right now that says environment can dictate phenotype. And so if we're saying there's a lot of morphological adaptability built into each kind, well, what happens for the first 1,000 years after the flood, according to the biblical model, is some very harsh environmental changes and conditions. And so a lot of these creatures that come off of the ark, the potential is there in the genome, but also in the environment for a lot of this front-loaded morphological adaptability to be manifested outwardly in change. And then maybe the speciation rate has slowed down after that first 1,000 years after the flood. But I would imagine that speciation rates were probably even quicker for that first 1,000 years after the flood, as these creatures have to migrate to less than ideal parts of the world and rapidly adapt or vary. Go ahead, whoever wants to talk.
If I can add,
Bubblegum wants to talk. Bubblegum, you go.
I was going to address one of the points Andrew made earlier, because he said, like, well, we wouldn't expect a crocoduck, but then, well, we do have an example of that. For example, the platypus. And so are you going to take that as evidence?
What is mosaic with the platypus?
It's a mammal that lays eggs.
That's the ancestral characteristic of mammals.
Yeah, that's not...
Andrew's argument was saying, well, evolution wouldn't
lays
expect
eggs as venom. Gives milk, lactates without nipples. There's so much.
Well, venom has evolved several different times. It's not like uniquely snake venom, for example. It's its own type of venom.
Yeah.
It's its own type of venom. And also, it has a stick
sensor. You were trying to say that was an example of mosaic with things that evolution would not predict it to be mosaic for. But
that was I was talking about the bear. That was a different argument. That was towards you. I was talking about the bear and the gorilla. No. This is towards a different comment that Andrew made.
Well, he said you wouldn't expect to find a crocoduck, and you're trying to use a platypus as an example, but there's reasons why it's not an example of that. Like the bill that a platypus
exactly an example
is not anything like a bird or duck bill. They are morphologically.
What about
the crocoduck argument? It's supposed to be like elements of mixed animals. A crocodile,
exactly. And a platypus doesn't have that.
Yes, it does. It's a mammal that has venom and lays eggs.
Grayson, what are your thoughts? Because I know you're a platypusologist. I knew when Bubbles brought it up, you're gonna go off on that. So I am curious as to your thoughts on. Correct me if I'm wrong. The platypus has claws like a reptile, and it also has hair like a bear. So how do those?
Okay, because it's a mammal. Nothing about like there are tons of mammals that have claws and tons of mammals that have hair, and like in terms of the traits of like how mammals evolved, like mammals like evolved from a common ancestor that laid eggs. It wasn't delivering live birth. That's why you have monotremes as the most basal group, which platypus are a part of.
So maybe I can.
What's the precursor to the extant platypus?
Yeah, I'll let Andrew clarify real quick.
Go ahead.
So I just want to clarify my original comment. So in the context of the crocoduck, looking at blending features of very distantly related groups, the blending you're concerned with here is blending of features unique to one group and unique to this other separate group, and putting them in the same animal, right? So you can have features that can change pretty easily, like the hair texture or fur or color, etc. If you have an animal that blends some of those, that's not really that important in an evolutionary context. Whereas if you saw like a mammal with distinct bird feathers, for example, that would be an example of a crocoduck kind of thing. The platypus doesn't really qualify for that. I hope that makes sense.
How many mammals lay eggs, Andrew?
The echidna does as well.
Yeah, monotremes. There's like 3 groups of mammals. There's like placental mammals, there's marsupials, and there's monotremes. Monotremes lay eggs.
So if there's only 2 kinds of egg-laying mammals on the planet today,
there's 4.
What's the other 2? We got the monotremes.
There are many
monotremes have like 4 species today.
Okay.
Somewhere around there. 4 types.
But are taxonomists not just forcing these interesting mosaics into these groups where they might not belong?
No, because they also have uniquely mammal features. These are
not just like forced, like arbitrary categorizations. Like monotremes are all genetically more similar to each other than they are to any other types of mammals.
Yeah, right. But just like in the design world, all SUVs are a lot more like each other than if you were to bring in, or crossovers, than if you were to bring in something else, an SUV or a van. So yeah, I get that there's a group, monotremes, that are all very similar to each other, but how can you not argue that they're an interesting mosaic?
Well, because they're more closely related to modern mammals than they are to any other reptiles, for example.
So, okay, any group, any creature on this earth that you pick any creature, it's going to have to, by definition, be more similar to another group and more distant to another. Humans are going to have to be more similar to something, and then more dissimilar. So of course, this interesting group, monotremes, are going to have to be closer to one creature than another. My point is that. Oh, good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted clarification on what point you were making with this, because, like, yeah,
my point is
the categories are not arbitrary.
Well, it's just expected on both sides that every single group on this earth, whether it's creation or the evolution model, we're going to be able to pick another group that they're most similar to. So monotremes are most similar to mammals.
Okay. So Donny, are you saying in any scenario you would expect a nested hierarchy? Like, there's no biological scenario where a nested hierarchy couldn't have developed. Is that what you're arguing?
Well, pick your creature. It's good. We can find out what it's going to be most similar to. And then
wait, Donny, just because you can, for any species, you can find another species that's the most similar to it, that doesn't mean that you would have a nested hierarchical pattern. I mean, when Linnaeus first,
I would argue it does.
When Linnaeus first noticed this nested hierarchical pattern, he was shocked and couldn't explain it, and he challenged all his peers who, like, this is before evolution. He challenged everyone. How can we explain this nested hierarchy? It was a mystery until evolution.
What? No,
that's like historically.
Well, if I was one of his peers, I could have explained it to him.
Okay, are you saying
the pattern of nested hierarchy is different than just saying these things should be more similar to these things? Because you could have like
humans. It's a logical necessity. It's a logical necessity. You can't define a dog by giving it the DNA of an alligator. So all dogs
you're just
have to
non sequiturs at this point, Bubblegum. But
no, it's a logical. That's not a non sequitur. It's a logical necessity. You can't define a dog by using alligator DNA. That's
nobody's
illogical.
Saying that. That's why it's a non sequitur.
Well, that's what you're requesting of Donny.
If scientists would have came to the original created kind 6,000 years ago, these created kinds were front loaded with pre-existing DNA differences, and those scientists were to do a genomic sequencing and then comparisons, they're going to conclude relationships that aren't actually there. I mean, these creatures were just created, but with pre-existing DNA differences that would reflect a hierarchical pattern, even though one creature didn't descend from another, because pre-existing DNA differences and then similarities in morphology, anatomy, and physiology necessitates a nested hierarchical pattern.
Wait,
just like
God designed.
Just like car companies accidentally. It's not like car companies say, okay, we're going to make vans and SUVs more similar to each other than vans and airplanes, or vans and a tractor, a semi-tractor trailer. No, it's just by accident. Just the fact that they're designing things with similar features and similar parts, that necessitates some kind of hierarchy. But the fact that God created
that, like, different manufacturers can create different SUVs or within a single category, sedans, whatnot, that are more similar to a completely different category just by like what kind of engine they have, what kind of fuel system they have, then they wouldn't be considered in the same category as other sedans, for example.
Yeah, the whole nested thing is arbitrary. You like saying like all these nested hierarchical patterns. Yeah, that's arbitrary because you can just choose which category you want to go down. And so if you choose a different yes, it is.
This is reflected in genetics.
No, it's not. Absolutely, it's not. It is not reflected in genetics.
Okay, here's a fact where we find the most dissimilarities.
Here's a fact, right? All mammals are more closely genetically similar to the other mammals than they are to any non-mammals. Therefore, mammal is not
because it's a logical necessity. That's
what makes a mammal a mammal?
Necessity.
Anybody on the panel?
Calling a banana is that arbitrary?
I can answer that.
Andrew, go ahead. What makes a mammal a mammal?
Yeah, so several things, and this actually gets into the other point I want to make, that a group by itself is not defined by a single trait, right? So
it's a group
mammals are right. It's a collection of traits. So mammals are defined by a few things, like just thinking off the top of my head, lactation. They have mammary glands. They have alpha keratin. They have keratinized hair. They have heterodont teeth, so different teeth configurations. You don't see that in reptiles, for example.
What about the middle ear? Is there something unique about the middle ear?
The free inner ear, middle ear bones, basically. So that kind of thing. So it's defined by a suite of characteristics.
The jaw is made up of how many bones?
Less than a reptile. I don't know the exact number, but I think the point that needs to be made is, like, for example, with mammals or just nested hierarchies in general, you wouldn't necessarily expect a nested hierarchy to come out of any biological scenario because of this fact that groups can be defined by many different traits. So, for example,
but here's the thing. But let me just, because you did a great job answering, Andrew, and you were right. Warm-blooded. They're vertebrates, so obviously they have backbones, but I guess that wouldn't necessarily be unique to them. But they got fur, hair, they produce milk to feed their young. You can get into the jaw, you can get into the
lots of
the skull, the middle ear, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so all of those considering is then by definition, because there's so many characteristics and traits that we're looking at to categorize a creature as a mammal. So we have this group. So of course, this group mammals are all by definition going to be more similar to each other than reptiles, or once you start bringing in amphibians, because they're going to lack that group of traits or characteristics that make a mammal a mammal. So why would we ever believe that there wouldn't be a hierarchy in terms of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and then the ones in between?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you could see a more random combination. So, for example, you could see would usually classify as a mammal with like all the defining mammal characteristics, except it lacks that inner jawbone, or it has a uniquely reptilian feature. For example, it has scales, but it has all the other defining characteristics that we would tend to associate with mammals. So if we had that kind of random combination, then the nested hierarchy would break down. If there was no evolution or modification over time, with this change happens first, and then it's inherited, and then this other change happens for next, and then that's inherited, and so on and so forth, then you wouldn't get a nested hierarchy. You would just have a random mixture of features that would just be due to chance.
Andrew, I appreciate that. I do have some responses, but I want to be fair. Redefine apologetics, my brother. Great to have you. You've been very patient, and I know you wanted to respond and make some points. So feel free to have the floor and respond to anything you'd like to. Just make sure to unmute. I see you're muted right now, and you're good to go. Are you able to hear us? Redefine apologetic.
Okay. All right. I think I have a lag on my part, about 12 seconds, give or take. There's a question I wanted to ask. I guess I can hear you. I can hear you. Okay. So the question I have, if evolution, I don't believe in evolution. I say nothing evolves, but people call speciation evolution just so they can say, yes, we see this happening and that is evolution. Speciation is not evolution. It's just something that people call evolution so that they can say, see, here's evolution. But my question is for those, I heard someone say that evolution predicted this and predicted that. If evolution is random, how can it predict anything? If it's random, a species that didn't have a wing could gain one wing and then gain another half a wing on the other side of the body and then lose the wing that it gained on the right side of the body, let's say right, left, if it's random. So if the question is, if evolution is random, how can it predict anything? But someone was talking about the variety of dogs and the dogs that were on the ark. How do we get something like, how do we get everything that we have from the dogs on the ark? Well, this would pertain not just to the dogs, but to everything that was on the ark. And that is this: God, being all-knowing, he would have known what two pairs of dogs or birds or fish went on there, but cats, whatever was on there, he would have known which two to bring on that have the greatest amount of variety that was going to lead to the greatest amount of speciation. I believe he brought the animals to Noah. So the horse kind, he would have known which two to bring together to allow for the greatest amount of speciation. Whether the dogs were clean or unclean, God knows everything. So he would have known, just like you know what you're going to get when you take a purebred shepherd and a purebred poodle. You know what you're going to get. God knew what he was going to get when he brought the animals to Noah, the ones that he bought. He would have bought them for the maximum amount of speciation, possibly. Those were the things I wanted to say. God knew what was going to come from the animals that he bought, the speciation that would be possible. And if evolution is random, how does it predict anything? That's my question.
Because evolution is not random.
The mutations are random, so they have selection for super guides evolution. Okay, can I make a point now, Donny?
Mutations are random.
All right, so Andrew, you said the platypus.
If it's not random, what is it? Guided.
So they have something called natural selection, which is just a tautology, which is just saying that which lives. And that's supposed to guide,
Go ahead.
You never heard of natural selection redefined? Apologetics? Have you ever been to science class? I'm just playing now.
All right. So Andrew, you made the comment that the platypus is okay. It's okay if the platypus lays eggs. Because
again, I have a lag. I've heard of that, but I would say I don't believe in natural selection, even though most people do. And that is because in order to have nature cannot select.
Sorry. There's no reason to assume that nature can't select. Like whenever you have a storm hit a town and some buildings are stronger than others, that's natural. That's like nature is selecting which buildings like maintain in the storm. So there's no reason to think that nature can't select.
No, the storm is not selecting anything. It just happens.
It just
the same thing with natural selection, dude. It just happens.
So what you're saying is it's chance.
Nature cannot
it's just
select.
By chance.
Okay, so you guys are just having it. This is just a language issue.
Yeah,
this is just an issue of semantics.
That's life.
You just don't like that I've attributed selection to a non-mind.
What would it be? Do you think God is like controlling every little thing? Is that what it is, or what's your explanation for it?
There's no selection going on. It's just that which lives.
Because it's more fit in its environment.
It's natural selection is basically
I just wanted to hear his explanation for it, since he doesn't believe in it.
Life happens.
It only survives because it is.
Yeah, but that's not really an answer, though. I mean,
that wasn't
it's basically differential reproduction. Who's reproducing the most? I would argue it's a fine-tuning mechanism that keeps a species as strong as it can be. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew or Grayson,
So,
you would define macroevolution as change at or above the speciation level or the species level.
Correct.
Sure.
Okay. So I think the better question, though, is what is occurring on a genetic level? What is occurring in the genetic content of these organisms when new species come about? This goes back to the 2023 review of the Galapagos Island and the Darwin's finches.
Wait,
but
Donny,
in 2017, when they observed that new species of finch form, genetically, if I'm not mistaken, it happened due to a shift in heterozygosity to homozygosity. So it was losing allelic variability. And as a result, it was labeled a new species. But that's what we would expect as creationists from the flood. You have heterozygous arc ancestors or arc archetypes. And from there, you have the sorting out of this allelic variability to create new variations or new species. But these aren't uphill changes. Go ahead.
There are multiple mechanisms that explain speciation, like polyploidy is one, where the chromosome number changes or even doubles, and then they're no longer able to crossbreed. But there's also other examples, just like ecological isolation.
With like fruit, like strawberries, and where like the whole genome basically duplicates.
Yeah, or like wheat, whatever. Like polyploidy has tons of examples. There's lots of flowers that have speciated because of such events. But there's also
artificially, or just in the wild on their own.
Yeah, in the wild, you can do this artificially, like we did with wheat. But yeah, it happens in the wild as well. But yeah, there is also like reproductive isolation. You just have like so many changes over time, just from two populations that are isolated from each other, that eventually the differences just become too great.
Right.
So let me address one of
go ahead.
Let me address one of Andrew's points. He said like that the platypus laying eggs is okay because the platypus came from a reptile. Is that correct there, Andrew?
No, because mammals are not included in the reptile. Wait.
Yeah, like bubblegum. You could just say that like
let's back it up.
Let's back it up. Evolved.
The platypus
from,
is
forms or like synapsids, and synapsids laid eggs.
So no.
Yes, what Grayson said.
So you're saying why this doesn't count as a crocodilic example, why the platypus doesn't count as a crocodilic example, is because even despite the platypus laying eggs, it has a common ancestor with reptiles. It came from a reptile, when its ancestor was a reptile, and so it's okay for the platypus to lay eggs. Is that correct?
Okay, bubblegum. I literally just clarified this point. I don't know why you keep insisting on.
No, I'm asking Andrew.
He agreed with my clarification.
What is your clarification? And does Andrew agree with it?
Just change reptile to synapsid, and we're good to go.
What's synapsid? Yeah. What do you mean by synapsid?
Hey, real quick, bubblegum, Donnie, I'm gonna hop off so you can let someone else get in here. It's been fun. Let you guys keep going. So I'll open up some space for you.
If we're not using the category, later, Josh. If we're not using the category of reptile, what is this new category?
Okay, I've got one person backstage that I'm not familiar with, and so in those cases, I just have to vet them due to things.
Let me get back to Andrew after that.
Yeah, of course. Okay, Dr. T-Rex, good to have you.
I know this guy. I think.
A spot just opened up. We're only allowed to have 10 on the panel, unfortunately. So can you introduce yourself and let us know what your position is? I'm not hearing any audio from you.
He's
not hearing any audio. You might have to deal with.
He's not saying anything.
Your mic. Make sure you have an external mic plugged in.
Might have technical issues. I don't know.
You want to try again? Talk, Dr. T-Rex. You're on mute now. Still
Hello?
Nothing. Oh.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you now.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Hello. Hello.
Yep. Feel free to give yourself an introduction. Let us know what your position is.
Hold on. Is there any way I can hear you guys from the stream? Okay.
Can you hear it from the stream?
Let me mute the stream on YouTube. Hold on.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Make sure
I just wanted to say my name is Dr. T-Rex, kind of a play on the name Dr. Dino. I guess my position is I'm a young Earth creationist, but I just wanted to kind of attack the foundation of the theory, which is that
It's not even a theory, speculation, man.
Evolutionists basically believe that all life came from a single-celled organism 3 billion years ago, and it's something that the evolutionists, whenever Dr. Dino does debate, Ken Hovind does debate these evolutionists, they kind of always shy away from it. He'll say, do you believe that we all evolved from a protozoa? And they'll say like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. And if the foundation of the theory is that all life originated from a single-celled organism 3 billion years ago, where is the proof of that? And they keep saying abiogenesis is not part of the theory, but if Darwin called his book the Origin of Species by means of natural selection. Well, all natural selection does is assume that life already exists. So, where's the evidence that life did evolve from a single-celled organism 3 billion years ago?
It's a weird question, but the fossil record.
Fossil record does not show that. Fossil record corroborates creationism.
That would be totally false, actually.
No, it doesn't.
No, it's actually right. It's actually precise.
That's just your opinion. No, it doesn't.
No, that's actually a fact.
Well, why don't you
calling it a
substantiate
fact doesn't make it a fact?
Yeah, why don't
It
you
is a fact. I'm saying
substantiate
it's reality.
that? Explain your point.
Well, you're just declaring that it is. That doesn't
All right,
mean anything.
let me just finish up with
actually
Andrew real
fact.
quick, and then we can get to that point. All right, so Andrew, so the reason you say the platypus doesn't count as a crocoduck example, which would debunk evolution, is because the platypus, despite laying eggs, it's okay that it lays eggs because it comes from a reptile ancestor. Correct?
Stop saying reptile.
What category you want to use?
It doesn't come from a reptile. Synapsids are not reptiles.
What are synapses?
They're amniotes, which lay eggs.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you guys on the StreamYard website for some reason. Is there any way to fix that? All I can do is hear myself.
I think it's
Probably plug your
T-Rex, do you hear me? Check.
Wait,
There's
so
no
you said
audio
it
on
came
the
from a
actual
snail?
Well, that's
No,
not good.
not a
Come
snail.
back
Bubble.
in.
I'll type it in the
T-Rex.
private chat so you know how to spell it.
Yeah, I typed it. I got a freaking snail.
Synapsids. You're not spelling it
No,
right.
I typed in amniotes.
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 Like an amniotic fluid that we all have.
Here, I'll type it in the private chat.
So that's a lizard. I'm getting a lizard.
No. Lizards are reptiles. Amniotes are pre-reptile.
Pre-reptiles. Okay. Pre-reptiles.
And also, just like amniotes are a larger umbrella category. Like we are amniotes. Reptiles are amniotes. Birds are amniotes.
I know, it's your fantasy. Let's just play by your fantasy. Okay.
We all have an amniotic egg sometime in development.
I mean, they do believe in evolution of fantasy, so I might as well just let them have.
So okay, so it's okay that they're despite the platypus being a mammal, because you have these, they come from amniotes, which lay eggs, and therefore
yes,
it's
because
okay.
the ancestral condition of amniotes is to lay an egg. That's what defines amniotes.
Now, if we had an ancestor in the lizard area that didn't lay eggs, would you consider that a crocoduck example?
Like an actual lizard that doesn't lay eggs?
Yes.
There are lizards that don't lay eggs, but no.
So you're saying you cannot use this? We cannot. So evolution becomes basically unfalsifiable because.
No, there are things that it just so happens that.
Look, you're not applying it consistently. You're not applying this line of argument consistently.
Well, I gave some examples earlier.
Look, lizards don't come from mammals, correct? So you can't say lizards.
Completely different lineages.
There's the point, Andrew. Lizards don't come from mammals. So why is a lizard giving birth? It's a crocoduck example.
It's giving birth in a different way than mammals.
Oh my!
Yeah, it's like
I have to just move past this.
Andrew,
the principle is that it's giving birth. Though.
It's a crocoduck
really
example.
Have to get into the anatomy of it.
It's supposed to lay eggs.
The mechanism by which lizards give birth is totally different than placental mammals.
Right.
Or marsupials.
Yeah, but that doesn't prove common descent.
No,
that doesn't necessarily.
We're not trying to prove common descent. That's not
what the whole theory is based on.
Eliminates
the whole
common
theory is based on
descent,
common
basically.
descent.
Yes, exactly.
We're responding to Bubblegum's question, which was not
you eliminated common descent.
Bubblegum, do you just have a problem with its classification?
No, look. If
what is the point? Get to the point. Like these guys have been answering you, and you just brush them off. Like
land the plane, Bubblegum. What's your what's your evolution defeating argument?
Andrew wanted a crocoduck example. I gave him a crocoduck example. He's not willing to take it now.
And I clarified that with the crocoduck example, I'm looking for the exact same trait having evolved the exact same way in two different lineages.
We see that
the
with
lizard
the
doesn't meet that
FOXP2
criteria. Gene. The platypus doesn't meet that criteria.
We see that with a FOXP2 gene, right? That's a FOXP2 gene is a clear example of that.
In what organisms?
It's present in the humans and it's present in the birds.
Are you saying that convergent evolution is the same
thing? You stop presupposing evolution. There's no such. You're presupposing evolution to justify to prove evolution.
Well, maybe if you had just let me finish my question, you would have understood what I was asking. I was asking you because we would consider these things that you're bringing up to be examples of like convergent evolution of like traits.
So when I give an example of crocodile,
again, you still don't allow me to finish.
Convergent evolution.
Dang, Bubblegum, you're just so hype. You're just so excited.
Let him finish. Let him finish, Bubblegum. They'll dig themselves into a hole.
He hasn't really had a turn, so I understand.
Okay, I want to say, like, you're bringing up examples that we would consider to be convergent evolution. I get that's a very triggering term for you, but are you wanting to say that convergent evolution is the same thing as like mosaic fossils?
Mosaic. Look, when you're saying convergent evolution, this is just an attempt to explain away the crocoduck. I gave you when people are talking about convergent evolution, it's saying, well, how did this animal evolve the same traits as this animal when they're not part of the same lineage?
That's the point.
It is the same. It is. It's literally the same freaking gene.
It's the same because they're not laying eggs; they're giving birth, right? Is that what you
right, but they're giving birth.
I'm also giving another example.
So
but the principle is that they're giving birth. A reptile usually lays eggs.
He already moved past that example. He's on the FOXP2 gene now.
No, Andrew wanted what's more specific. I gave him something more specific.
And is that gene found in any intermediate groups between birds and humans?
So they have the same gene.
And right, but is that gene found in any intermediate other groups besides birds and humans?
Clearly, humans and birds don't have a similar lineage, right? A close lineage.
That's my question is specific. So that gene is found in birds and is found in humans, right?
Well, Andrew,
that's an example of a crocoduck in your face.
Is that same gene also found in any other groups in between? Yes or no?
To my knowledge, it's not. It's an example of convergent evolution.
Okay, that's what I want to clarify.
Are you going to give up evolution now?
What about Andrew?
Not an example of a mosaic quality.
Andrew, what about orphan genes? And I understand, we can get into de novo gene synthesis and gene duplication and so on and so forth. But is this not what a creationist would expect, that we have these taxonomically restricted but yet essential genes, okay, let's say in humans, that aren't found in chimpanzees, that aren't found in gorillas, and they're called orphans because where's their parents? As in there's no evidence for the precursor genes that led to these orphan genes. Like if I were to show you 3 different books, I could show you sentences in book 1 that are unique to book 1, as in they're not found in the other 2 books, and so on and so forth with the other 2 books. And so we do have unique functional genes that are only found in one creature but not found in another, and no evidence for their evolution.
Well, I would say that
really quick. I was incorrect. I want to specify I was incorrect. FOXP2 protein is also found in fish, reptiles like alligators, zebra finches, and mice, and like chimpanzees, and tons of other things.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to clarify, if it was found in any other groups. What was I gonna say? So what you said, Standing, isn't strictly true, I would say, because you have the actual orphan gene in one species, right? But in other species that we would consider closely related to it based on other lines of evidence, you find a gene that's homologous to it that doesn't actually code for like a functional protein, but codes for like an RNA that ultimately would fold up into that protein. So you do still have evidence of the nested hierarchy there. And yes, it probably a lot of these cases does go back to de novo gene origination, but you still have evidence for its evolution.
You're to me, that seems like evolutionary philosophy, and feel free to challenge me. But so you're assuming that in a closely related species, let's say chimpanzees. So we have these taxonomically restricted essential genes in humans. But you're saying, well, we find, because you use the word homology, so we find a similar gene or DNA element in chimpanzees, but it's a non-coding gene. And so that could be, or give us an idea of what the ancestral gene looked like before it mutated or altered in a way that became the orphan gene that we're looking at in the human genome. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Right, and it doesn't even have to be between like chimps and humans, for example. It can be between species that most creationists would consider a single kind. So, like pigs or something.
That non-coding RNA gene could be there for a functional reason, doing what it does. We know there's RNA products produced all the time, and not protein products. You're assuming, or it seems like you're imposing on it, well, since we have orphan genes, now we got to find some homologous genes in closely related species and argue, okay, this is an example of what the ancestral gene would have looked like. But you haven't demonstrated that in the lab. We haven't observed that non-coding RNA gene mutate in a way where it's an essential gene that we would call an orphan gene in humans, for example. Isn't this a lot of historical reconstruction going on?
Well, like you do have experiments though where they take basically gibberish nucleotides and mutate it in such a way that not like by random mutations, and it forms a de novo gene with a functional protein. So that has been observed.
So you're arguing that in the lab, they've mutated a non-coding section of the genome, and they've altered it in a way where it produces a functional protein?
Right. Yeah. You have mutations in that region, random mutations, and it produces it now. That de novo gene now produces a functional protein or a functional product of some kind.
Okay. What would be the best paper you could cite for that?
I could try finding it offhand.
Well, you don't have to do it. I don't want to put you on. Maybe just send it to me, and so
sure,
I can. Yeah. Is this with fruit flies?
I'd have to look at this. The specific paper, but I think Creationists might have brought it up at some point in one of his videos. So I'll have to look and see what specific paper he was mentioning and if there are any others like that.
Yeah,
I can send it to you if you want.
I would definitely like to see that paper if the claim is that, hey, we've got a non-functional part of the genome, it's non-coding, or it's just producing an RNA product, and it's been mutated intentionally, I guess in the lab is what it sounds like. And the mutations or series of mutations altered it from a non-coding RNA gene to a functional protein coding gene, something brand new.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's been observed, but I could be wrong.
I believe I've seen this study too. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I believe like they just added like random inserts of just like completely random orders of nucleotides and onto like a coding gene, and just to see what would happen. And then like a pretty decent percentage of those ended up being more efficient and more functional than the original, just by adding like random information, basically.
I think there might have been a different paper that, yeah, I'll have to look and see if which specific one it was.
That could be a different paper though, too.
But regardless of the evolutionist explanation for, I've heard de novo gene synthesis, like we're talking about non-coding regions of the genome. They can be hit with mutations and become a functional coding region or element, or, you know, gene duplication, basically non-coding region duplicates, and then it's hit with a series of mutations, it becomes a functional gene, becomes an orphan gene. But the greater point is the orphan genes that we see, the distribution or the patterns in orphan genes that we find across the biological world, they don't really have a consistent hierarchy. It's a little bit all over the place. Would you at least agree with that?
In some cases, yeah. If I may, like, ask a follow-up question, then, if many orphan genes are found at the species level, then doesn't that also negate what you would say would be created kinds, a common ancestry within a kind, basically? Like, it feels like you can't have it both ways.
That right there is a fantastic question, and I feel like we could do an entire orphan gene debate and discuss that. But yeah, that's the greater question of, okay, we see these taxonomically restricted and essential genes today in extant species. How can we trace those back to the precursor ancestors or the original created kinds? Because, and I'll show this visually, I think it's easier, because again, it's a really good question, is because we would all agree that there's diversification, there's variation, speciation. And so let's say from creation, right, you have humans that are created with certain sets of orphan genes, or take dogs, canids, they're created with certain sets of orphan genes. After creation, once they start moving out, or even after the flood, let's say 4,500 years ago, once they start moving out and you have speciation events, isolation, inbreeding, so on and so forth, you're getting the sorting out of the original orphan genes, right? Where maybe now you have lions with certain orphan genes that tigers don't have because of divergent speciation, so on and so forth, right? So yeah, those original orphan genes are now spread out in a way where they can be species specific. And so the question is, how can we take, let's say, species within the felid family, and take the orphan genes that are specific to lions, the orphan genes that are specific to cheetahs, leopards, and say which ones were all in the original archetype. Does that kind of make sense, Andrew, what I'm saying?
I think so. I have some issues with it, but I, like you said, I think that could be a whole other conversation than we have been going back and forth.
Right. It would kind of be like this. So here on the phylogeny, you got humans, right? So they're created with all the different orphan genes. Then they move out, and let's just say after the flood, you get groups moving away, breakaway populations. You got Denisovans, Neanderthals, Erectus. Well, they're going to take subsets of the original genetic variability and DNA elements with them. And so that means Neanderthals could have their own orphan genes that, let's say, you know, Floresiensis doesn't have, but their common ancestor over here would have had them. But
so you're saying kind of like alleles segregating out, like individual orphan genes would be segregating out under your model,
right? Because it isn't by definition that kind of how speciation or variation. You know, I don't believe humans can speciate, but let's say, you know, whatever the gorilla ancestor was or chimp ancestor, the breakaway populations are not going to have. There is going to be a sorting out process, correct? In speciation, we have the inbreeding, especially if you're reducing shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity, like we're seeing in these papers, specifically the finch species. By definition, that's a loss of allelic variability. And so many of the orphan genes can be lost. Let's say in one lineage, the orphan genes are lost, specific ones, but then in another lineage, they're retained. So yeah, it's species specific, but it doesn't negate created kinds. We have to figure out what orphan genes were present in the original created kinds.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I feel like I still have issues with that explanation, but yeah.
Well, see, I would argue, and I know someone else was going to say something, and I think we're going to start winding it down, because I said at the beginning we're going to keep this about 4 hours. It's been about 4.5 hours. So I'll say this, and then you guys go at it for a little bit, then we'll wind things down. It's been fun. We got many more of these this month, though. So I would argue it's much easier to break a gene, it's much easier to lose a gene than to build one up from scratch. And so orphan genes have been lost over time, where, yeah, they are species specific, but were they species specific going right back to the creation event or even the flood, you know, before they were lost or before they were segregated? I would argue not necessarily. So yeah, I think the better explanation is orphan genes have been lost or broken down rather than built up through de novo gene synthesis or gene duplication, so on and so forth. Anyways, go ahead. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say in the conventional evolutionary model, you can have gene loss and de novo gene origination. So it kind of depends which one you're talking about specifically, but it probably is a combination of factors.
Let me just clarify real quick. See, I said, no, I don't believe in genes from scratch. My point was it's much easier to break a gene or to lose a gene than to build it from scratch. So where the evolutionists would say, well, a lot of these orphan genes are species specific is because they've been added. I would argue, no, a lot of them have been lost.
And I will freely admit that it is a very, it is a field of research that is still ongoing, as most scientific fields are. So we of course don't have all the answers.
And for us too, creationists, because you asked an excellent question. Because the first question is, how do you explain orphan genes? We would say they're created, right? That's why we find them unique to various kinds. But then, you know, you would argue de novo gene synthesis, gene duplication, so on and so forth. But then the next question, the bigger question, and it's a great question: why are they species specific? And I think that's where it comes down to the separate ancestry versus the universal ancestry model. In how can we explain the pattern of distribution of orphan genes?
Sure. Yeah.